So some of the things you're saying about kind of language and the questions being asked can reflect on what you were saying a little while ago about the questions being asked of female athletes. I remember just after the election, I think Nicky Morgan and somebody else were walking up Downing Street and the photographer wanted to get a picture. They shouted "Morning girls" at them and they were both kind of horrified that they'd be spoken to in that way. I remember someone saying to me on Twitter, what was he supposed to say? I was like, "Morning ministers?" Don't know.
Or just good morning or
morning.
But I mean, this is the thing. People do sort of sometimes have a bit of a understanding bypass and say, well, it's not a problem to say girls. Well, it might not be a problem, and it depends on what the context is. Because you might talk about going for a night out with the girls in a way that someone might talk about going for a night out with the boys. But do you think if their counterparts, you know, Michael Gove and Greg Hams were walking down Downing Street, the photographers would have called out, "Morning, boys." You know, so in order to understand is something sexist, you know, just do that inversion and just see. Or, you know, think about it in terms of race. You know, if this wasn't a comment being made about the gender of the person, but it was a comment being made about the race, would we think that was all right, or would we think that was horrendous? And very often, you suddenly realise that it is.
Absolutely. Another question from the floor, please.
Johnny, I'd like to ask you, what can politicians do? How far can you affect change on the issue of discrimination?
So, I think there's various ways to try to tackle the issue, and some of them politicians can be very involved in, you know, making sure the law is in the right place. So, obviously we have the Equality Act. But then there's also a sort of cultural piece, which is more nuanced in how politicians can help set the agenda. So, you know, when John Infidel made those comments in 2013, Maria Miller, she was then both DCMS Secretary of State, but also Minister for Women and Equality. You know, she wrote a letter to the BBC, you know, pointing out that kind of sexism was unacceptable. So there's things that ministers and, you know, politicians can do to put that marker down and to encourage change. So before I became Equalities Minister, my predecessor Lynn Featherstone, you know, she created a charter on homophobia in sport to try and get some of the different parties around the table to look at what could be done on that more generally. So I think that sort of convening power that politicians have and the ability to challenge is a useful one. And obviously in the case of broadcasters like the BBC or you know, Channel 4 is obviously a public service broadcaster as well, then there is obviously a funding stream, and you don't want politicians in the day-to-day editorial decisions, but public service broadcasting obviously should be conforming to pretty high standards in terms of equality.
How receptive do you find kind of media organisations or governing bodies?
So it's getting better. I mean, the BBC obviously hasn't always got it right, but has typically, when I've raised equalities issues generally with them, have typically been pretty good, and they are, I think, in the sort of the vanguard on some of this. I know the sports bodies, it varies quite a lot. So my fellow Equalities Minister, Helen Grant, was the sports minister for quite some time, so she probably dealt more directly with them. But, you know, she was trying to address all sorts of issues, ethnic diversity as well as gender diversity. And, you know, she found some of them very hard work in terms of understanding. I think particularly in something like football, it's, you know, I think there's so many cultural problems, and you just need to look at, you know, FIFA, which sort of, on the one hand, everybody seems to have known for ages that things haven't been right, but yet nobody's really sorted it out. And you just think, well, you know, what's the culture there? You know, how is this being allowed and being accepted to just go on? And so I think that blindness to recognising there's a problem is there, and particularly when you have people entrenched and they've been there for a very long time, and you've got a very kind of you know, male macho culture. Then I think that's problematic, both in terms of gender diversity and also in terms of the other diversity strands too.
Another question from the floor?
Working for equality, do you bring up many male-orientated discussions or problems, or do you mainly focus on women with you being women and it directly affecting you?
So, I mean, I think it was mainly women's issues because on more of the issues women are at a disadvantage. There are certainly areas where men are facing significant problems as well. I think mental health would be one of those. You know, the suicide rates amongst men is a significant cause for concern in terms of health problems, and certainly in government, it was my colleague at the Department of Health, Norman Lamb, who made a real push on mental health funding and to really say, look, mental health should be taken just as seriously as physical health conditions, and that should be matched with the funding, and previously that hadn't been the case. And he's still very much advocating for that in Parliament. So yes, there are definitely issues that on an equalities basis end up affecting men more than women. But in the big picture, it tends to be women that are more disadvantaged in society. That said, it's not just as simple as sort of men and women, because obviously there are a lot of different characteristics when you take into account race and disability and sexual orientation, and so there were obviously, one of the big projects that I implemented was a project on homophobic bullying in schools to try to assess different types of intervention that could help to address that problem, because there is a huge amount of misery created in schools for young people who either are gay or who aren't gay but experience the bullying anyway, or have gay parents or whatever. So yeah, there's a whole host of different issues that need to be addressed as well.
So another hand up over there, Dane.
So I'm all right in saying there's 650 MPs.
Correct.
And when the MP's expenses scandal came out, you came third, having spent £193,000 of taxpayers' money. And this included 20 quid on boots, £1 on window cleaner, 5 quid on food, 19 quid on toothbrush refills. Is it sensible to be spending that sort of money on personal products when we see 1 million people homeless, we see 1,100 in a Scottish town on food banks, and we see refugees dying trying to get to Britain?
Well, I think you've gotten quite a lot of different things conflated there. When the list came out that I was the third highest last year, that in all of the budgets apart from one, I had underspent. And in the one that was significantly more than it would usually be, that was my staffing budget. And the reason for that was that I had 3 members of staff on maternity leave in that 1 year. And, clearly when a member of staff's on maternity leave, you employ maternity cover, and there's a contingency budget accordingly. There obviously was a huge problem with MPs' expenses back in 2009, and I always advocated for transparency. In fact, I was one of the people who didn't necessarily make myself very popular with my colleagues for having done so, and for having said that the Speaker at the time had not responded properly and had to go. There was a full review by an independent guy, Thomas Legg, who looked at my expenses in detail and found that there were no issues to answer. So, I don't know exactly the various bits that you've got there, but it's not figures that I particularly recognise, and obviously everything is published online, and you can go and have a look, as my constituents were able to do so. I think it's worth remembering that the vast amount of money that is called expenses for MPs goes to pay the people who write the letters, who open the mail, who answer the phones, to help the thousands of constituents that contact each MP every year. And those vulnerable individuals in society who get support from their MPs can only get that support if there are staff to be able to do that really important work.
When you were an MP, how much travelling time would you have? Because obviously, kind of backwards and forwards from your constituency.
So it was about 12 hours a week. The journey from Eastern Bartonshire to London is about 400 miles in each direction. So it did take a significant chunk of time. I ended up often taking the train because then I could get stuck into a lot of work. I have to confess that when my son was born, I didn't quite have the appetite for a sort of 5-hour train journey twice a week with a small baby, so I tended to fly between Glasgow and actually often London City, just over the water, whichever way it is, and that was at least more manageable with an infant. But yeah, it was a lot of travelling, but others had it harder. You know, one of my colleagues was the MP for Orkney and Shetland, and he would have times that, you know, he couldn't get all the way back there. He would fly as far as Aberdeen, and then the conditions would be so bad that he had to spend the night in Aberdeen in a hotel somewhere because there was no flights or ferries able to land.
Do you think British politics is still too London-centric?
Well, I think the advantage of the constituency system is that you do have people from all different parts of the country. I think that it's certainly the case that with most of the media based in London, obviously the BBC now has got a big operation in Salford and other regional operations. But I think with a lot of the journalists, certainly the political journalists based in London, it can be a bit Westminster bubbly and a bit London-centric. And indeed, you know, I was surprised actually even in government how few ministers were from sort of far-off places. You know, when I was trying to sort of explain, I mean, even just sort of practical things like getting the ministerial box to me at the weekend, I was kind of going, how difficult can this be to get it delivered to me? I was like, what do the other ministers do? And they were like, well, they can just send a car to get it to them because they were sort of within an hour's drive of London or whatever. So yeah, I think there does need to be always an awareness that, you know, you're serving the whole country, and, you know, what is the case in London is often going to be very different challenges than a rural area will have, or an island community will have, or, you know, the north of England will have. Yeah.
The current baby of the house, Myra Black, that's a title that you once had. I just wondered, because I'm always kind of intrigued by it, how does that work for you? Did that work in your favour? Can it sometimes be a little bit of a hindrance?
Well, I didn't really enjoy the title Baby of the House. I didn't mind being called the youngest MP. But Baby of the House always felt a little bit infantilising. It probably meant there was more interest, which could be a good thing, but it also meant people were more aware of your age. So some of my colleagues that were maybe only 1 or 2 years older than me, because they weren't Baby of the House, in a sense, people didn't have an idea of their age in quite the same way, and so wouldn't necessarily, I'm not quite saying it was condescending or patronising, but they sort of have you badged as young. And sort of forever, because in politics you're young at 40, you know, it's like you never get allowed to not be young. I think, obviously I disagree with her views on Scottish independence, but I think she's making a really good mark for herself. One of the best things actually that came out of being Baby of the House was there was a Blue Peter programme about Guy Fawkes and the gunpowder plot, and they wanted to speak to an MP about it, and so as the youngest MP I got to be interviewed by Blue Peter. I got a Blue Peter badge.
Any more questions on the floor?
Joan, your work as a politician and also like the research you're doing for the book, what have you seen? Have you seen the contrast with other countries, other societies who work on discrimination in sport better than we do here, and what lessons can we take from there?
So, I mean, certainly this is a problem that nobody's entirely got sussed, and I think you know, in different countries there are, you know, different elements to which there are issues. Obviously, in some countries where the position of women in society is significantly behind us, you know, there's lots of places where even getting a woman to actually participate in the team at major sporting events, such as the Olympics, has in itself been a problem. So I don't think we're necessarily lagging behind, but I think looking at the international comparatives is going to be a really interesting area to explore, and particularly in terms of the international sporting competitions and how that can be used as a means to get better progress across the world, like saying you can't enter this competition unless you have both men and women represented. You know, are there other things like that can be done to use international organisations and institutions to further the cause? There's obviously always a debate about how political does sport become, but I think in that way it is quite possible to have some exciting progress. Separately to this, I'm on the committee of the Women of the World Festival that the South Bank Centre does every March, and they are expanding and doing Women of the Worlds in lots of different countries, and there's actually plans to do one alongside the Commonwealth Games in 2018, so to sort of use that world, everyone coming together, to also celebrate women in all of those Commonwealth countries.
What support is there for MPs inside Westminster who perhaps sometimes during their job do feel oppressed or do feel slightly dismayed at how they're treated within Parliament?
I think it's probably true to say not enough, and not just for MPs, but for the staff that work in Westminster, where I think there's perhaps even more cause for concern, because if people work for a member of Parliament, there isn't, if for example you've got a problem with your boss, where do you go? So the House of Commons authorities have been trying to put in place better support mechanisms and places that you can go with concerns and access HR advice. So there's an HR department in Parliament, even though the direct employers are the MPs. But yeah, I think grappling with some of this is one of the challenges. I mean, in a very informal basis, what often happens is that that colleagues support each other. And if I saw women in other parties, getting badly treated or a particularly horrible piece of sexist coverage or something like that, then I would typically then go up to them or send them a text or whatever, and say, don't worry, they're just ridiculous, and don't let it get you down too much. I mean, there was the recent horrendous example of Jess Phillips, Labour MP, and she had expressed an opinion, one I actually happened to disagree with, because she'd said that she didn't think there was a need for an International Men's Day debate. I actually thought that debate would be a good debate to have, but actually that's beside the point. As a result of her expressing that opinion, she received horrendous rape threats and threats of very, very disgusting and explicit sexual violence, and for having an opinion. So anyway, lots of MPs of all parties and politicians and people across the country tweeted supportive messages to her and so on, which I'm sure helps, but nonetheless it's not pleasant. And in her view, she was like, my sons are 10 and 7, I don't want them going on the internet and reading this kind of stuff about their mum.
Any more questions on the floor?
Sorry, was it 12 hours it said it took you to get home from Westminster?
12 hours a week.
12 hours a week. So
6 hours each way. So
wouldn't it have made sense to live in London? Actually, you did, didn't you?
During the week.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Monday to Thursday you live in London, and then you go back to the constituency on a Thursday night.
So you spent 18 grand 1 year on paying rent for that London home from taxpayers' money. And it clearly states in the law that where an MP is claiming accommodation expenditure, the MP must be routinely resident at the property. So do you think it is sensible to be spending probably a working class wage a year on having a second house?
So to do the job, you need to be in Parliament and in your constituency. And if your constituency is in London, then you can live in London and you don't need to have somewhere else to stay. But if you're 400 miles from London, you can't commute there every day. And so, yeah, I think it makes sense for the taxpayer to make sure that MPs can be active in the constituencies and can also be active in Parliament. And we used to have a system where the people that were MPs were typically landed gentry, and they went to their constituency once a year. And how are you supposed to be able to represent people if you're not holding regular advice surgeries, if you're not going to visit local businesses and speak to local schools and understand the issues people are facing? So, your basic issue is that it costs money to have people doing the job of an MP. And it does. But I think it's really important that MPs can be active in their constituencies and travel to London and stay somewhere where they're in London. And not to have to be in a situation where they already have a massive property portfolio of homes in different places before they even stand to become an MP. Because if that were the case, and you're 20-year-old Mary Black, she would never have been able to get elected.
And do you think there is a problem still with kind of perhaps access to politics, the same as we talked about before, access to media? There's this idea that obviously you have unpaid internships to get a foot in the door, and the politics and media are very similar in that.
Well, exactly. And that, I think, is a real issue. In fact, one of the schemes I was involved in Parliament was setting up with Hazel Blears and a Conservative MP called Eric Ollerenshaw, a scheme called the Speaker's Parliamentary Placement Scheme to get people from underrepresented backgrounds who wouldn't be able to afford to come to do that kind of unpaid internship to come to Parliament, to be paid and to have a really interesting experience that would then give them the opportunity to go on and work in other jobs in politics. And I think through the process of doing that, we also started to change the culture in Westminster of, are unpaid internships acceptable? Now, I wouldn't say that they don't exist at all there now, but if you look at the proportion and the numbers of MPs offering unpaid internships, it has dramatically dropped in the last 5 years or so, which I think is a really positive thing. And, the cost of getting involved, and it is the same in media, and, you've got organisations like Channel 4 that do really great internship schemes that help people who would not otherwise be able to do so to get that first foot on the ladder. And I think, it also is one of the things that doesn't help the gender representation in politics. To stand for election, you've got your basic costs, which the political party will tend to cover. It's £500 deposit. Then you actually have to pay for leaflets. During just the final 4 or 5 weeks of an election campaign, you're typically spending £11,000. But then if you think about the campaign for several years running up to that, you're easily talking tens of thousands of pounds, and in some cases, and in some of the seats this time round, depending on the parties, some of them were swimming in money, hundreds of thousands of pounds to try to win a parliamentary seat. Now, obviously, some people put their own money into that and have the ability to do so. For most people, they have to spend significant amounts of time going out there to raise money, which is fine up to an extent. But I'd hate us to get to the position that they have in American politics, where that is what most of a candidate's time is spent doing. Because actually, more valuable are the conversations you have on the doorsteps or on the telephone with the voters. So I do think that is an issue, the access to politics and the cost of political campaigning.
Because there's also this kind of idea that to be a successful MP or to get one of the plum jobs in the cabinet, you've got to be kind of educated at Oxford or Cambridge, having been privately educated prior to that, a job as a parliamentary advisor, and then move up the ladder that way rather than, I guess, in inverted commas, real-world experience.
Yeah, I think that's not the only route, but clearly there are people that take that route, and there are, if you look even just in Parliament, the percentage of people that have been privately educated is really high compared to the normal population. Similarly, those who've gone to Oxford or Cambridge. And I went to my local comprehensive school in Glasgow. I studied at LSE, as I said, and I actually feel like I've had a fairly privileged upbringing because, I went to a good state school and, went to university, and, parents that, 100% all the way wanted to say to me that there was no limit on my ambition and I could go for whatever I wanted to try to achieve. But yeah, in Parliament, even sort of my background is not seen as privileged in that sense. So I found that sort of quite strange, and definitely there's in fact a worrying trend about the socioeconomic diversity within Parliament, because what you used to get in the Labour Party in particular, you used to get a lot of people being elected as MPs who'd come through the trade union movement and been shop stewards and so on, and that has declined in recent years, and that has meant there is more of this track of people who've got similar experiences. And what you really want in Parliament is a proper representation of the country. You want people of different ages, of different gender, different sexual orientation, some with disabilities, some without. You want to have people who've come from different walks of life, some teachers, some people who've been in business, some people who've been manual workers, because that way you can much better represent and make decisions that are affecting the whole country.
So, but do you think this kind of increasingly homogenous, I guess, Parliament leads to some of the attitude that Dean was hinting at, this kind of idea that MPs are kind of separate from the rest of the country, don't quite understand what's going on?
Yeah, I think so. I think the other thing is it's it's a kind of strange scenario because people want politicians to be really normal. What is normal? Good question in itself. But then actually what's required, you have to be perhaps a little bit strange in order to do it, because most people don't want to spend all of their weekend knocking on doors in the rain, speaking to people, and sort of endless campaigning. And so there's the political sort of geekery that comes within that system, and that even once you get elected, that you sort of have to maintain that complete devotion to it is something which in itself is not a very normal experience. And living and working in two different places. I mean, there's people who work on oil rigs, or people who work in the forces who are perhaps similarly travelling a lot and going from one place to another. But it is a bit unusual in itself, because I would find that the constituency, people would say to me, so how often do you have to go to London to Parliament then? And I'd go, well, every week. And I'd go, oh, right. And you would get people saying, oh, and how often are you back in the constituency? People would say to you in London. You're kind of like, well, pretty much every week. But a lot of people don't realise that that's what it entails.
Okay, one
So
question.
just one more. The general election this year, the Liberal Democrats suffered quite a lot. I just wondered where you see the party at the next general election. Is there time to rebuild and regain credibility?
Absolutely, and I'll answer that in just a second, but I'm hoping that this isn't quite the last question, because it really would be great to get a question from one of the girls, given the topic of the discussion. Yeah, I mean, obviously not a great night for the Liberal Democrat. But I still think there's a really important place for a Liberal Party in the centre of British politics. I think that it's needed perhaps more than ever. I think that it will, and is already becoming increasingly clear to people, how the last government was a coalition government and this government is a Conservative government. And I think at the time, particularly because it had been such a long time since we'd had a Conservative government, people didn't necessarily see the difference, and they sort of assumed that the Conservatives would be the same as a coalition government, when actually we were forcing the government to do certain things and stopping the government doing other things that perhaps weren't seen. So yeah, I think we can rebuild. I think politics is in a state of flux at the moment. If at the beginning of this year you had asked a bookies for odds on the Conservatives winning a majority and Jeremy Corbyn being leader of the Labour Party, you'd have made a killing. Right? So it's quite difficult to predict things at the moment, and that can be challenging, but actually that also creates opportunities. So my party's faced oblivion before on various occasions, and come back. And I think what we've done now is been able to prove that we can be a credible party in government and achieve significant changes. And we obviously need to get back to the roots of the grassroots campaigning that helped us in the first place. And I think with Tim Farron as leader, he's made a really good start on that. And the experience on the doorsteps already is very different. There's a lot of people out there, even if they haven't been Lib Dem supporters, they think, well, you probably didn't deserve to go from 57 MPs to 8. They might have been annoyed with some of the stuff that we did, but there's a lot of people that kind of think, no, that doesn't really feel quite fair. And politics isn't always fair. I mean, that's what elections are like. But I think that means there's quite a fertile ground there for us to go out there and rebuild and get a good hearing.
Alex.
In sport, if someone's racist, the victim is protected. I'm sure when more gay people come out, if someone's homophobic, then they'll be protected. It doesn't seem the case when sexism gets involved, so where do we get our protection from?
Well, legally it should be from the same place, because the Equality Act does also apply to sex discrimination. But I think you're right that certainly in terms of the difference with racial discrimination, there is rightly, and I'm glad this is the case, there is an abhorrence towards it and a lack of tolerance towards it. And that hasn't always been the case. But somehow a lot of times sexist behaviour gets sort of written off as, well, it's just banter, or, well, that's just the way he is, and isn't really taken as seriously. And that's partly because amongst a lot of the decision makers within the industry, it's not as big a deal. And actually, genuinely, I think it isn't always understood what an impact it can have, because they think, well, it was just a joke. And And in a sense, it might have even been meant as a joke. But it can have a very, very significant impact on that individual. And so I think one of the things that we need to do is help people understand why it is so important and what an impact, like continual low-level sexist comments or harassment, what impact that can have on people's confidence and whether or not they actually want to stay in that industry, whether or not they go, hang on a second. I mean, if you look at the finance industry, they've got this problem at the moment in banking. And part of that is you get good, talented women starting out in the industry, and the culture is really not very enjoyable to be in. And they go, well, hang on a second, I can go and work in another part of business and not have to be dealing with this in quite the same way. So, frankly, see you later. And, a lot of sport will end up in the same elements as that if it doesn't get its act together. So the legal protection's there, but it's often not easy to use that legal protection, so you need to create the culture where it's seen as unacceptable as well.
Do you think one of the issues is if someone's being racist, it's plain obvious that they're being racist? Like, some people, it seems to always be aligned with that, whereas with sexism, sometimes there is a bit of a question over whether it is a sexist comment or whether
it's just a compliment.
Yeah, it's like one of the issues is where is the line with sexism?
Yeah, I do think that, and also because people will then claim that the intent was a positive one, a bit like John Inverdale's comment, it is a lack of understanding that, this woman is there as a professional, as an athlete, doing a job, and that is how you ought to be engaging with them and talking to them and commenting if you're a sports commentator on what they do, and that by having a little side comment about what she looks like in a dress or whether she's particularly beautiful or even worse, as you would get on the kind of chants on some of the terraces or whatever, what you might like to do to her. That's not just a bit of fun. Actually, that undermines her professionalism, what she's there to do. And I think it just really needs to be seen in that light, but can often just be dismissed as not particularly serious, not a big a deal. What are you getting so worked up about? That kind of attitude, and challenging it, which is not. I know that's not always easy to do. So sometimes also, I think, in a scenario where you have 3% of sports journalists are women, and in different sporting bodies in terms of management, you'll get very small numbers of women who are actually in there. Them also having good support networks with each other can be really important. I certainly found that in politics, that there would be that camaraderie between women of different political parties, because you also had a shared experience and a shared understanding. It's obviously not to say you only ever did things in women's networks, but sometimes that would just give you the the kind of collective confidence that you needed to challenge the stuff that was wrong.
Okay, so we'll draw it to a close there. I'm sure we'd like to thank Jo for joining us this afternoon.